Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful.
Well, welcome to the third of these videos on the environment in which public policy is made. And in this one, we're going to focus on the economic environment. A lot of this you'll probably already know, but I think you'll find this interesting as you begin to explore how the economy relates to the public policy process in the United States. All right, so let's get started by talking about the economic environment. And first, let's just look at the classic definition of economic growth in any country, which is growth in gross domestic product. And as you can see, since the 1920s, growth in the gross domestic product of the United States in constant dollars, that means accounting for inflation, has been quite steady from at least the post-World War II period through 2017. You'll see a dip there, well, right around 2007, 2008, at the beginning of the what we call the Great Recession. But then look how it turned around. The Great Recession did a lot of economic damage to a lot of people, but that recession did not look that big on this chart. You'll see the amount is actually relatively small, but it still resulted in a lot of policy actions that changed the way investment banks do business, for example, mortgage lending. And a lot of people are still pretty spooked by what happened during the economic crisis of 2008, 9, right around in there. What are some of the policy implications of this? Really simple. Economic growth is a main national goal. I don't think that anybody would be surprised by that. But there are major debates over how to promote economic growth. And at the heart of this debate is Keynesian notions of stimulus, of economic stimulus, are controversial because Keynesian notions of economic growth, government spending may stimulate consumer spending and therefore economic growth, but at the expense of creating larger budget deficits and then in the long term, a larger national debt. And what I mean by Keynesian is the notion first put forth by John Maynard Keynes that governments should deficit spend in particular, that is, should spend more money than they take in taxes and other revenues during recessions in order to stimulate the economy and then make up the difference in times of economic growth. We've kind of pursued a half Keynesian approach where we raise a lot of, or we spend a lot during recessions to stimulate the economy, but we don't make up that spending by taxing people at a higher rate, especially the wealthy, after a recession to make up the losses in the prior years. So as you'll see in the following charts, the national debt and annual budget deficits have been going up pretty consistently for the last several decades. In fact, let's take a look at that now. This figure shows federal budget deficits and surpluses from 1940 to 2018. And just so that we're all clear, negative numbers are budgets, deficits. Positive numbers, anything over the zero line is a budget surplus. What this means is the difference between how much the government takes in, the federal United States government takes in revenue, and how much it spends. And throughout the the data skipped from the 1960s to the 1980s, but throughout the 1980s and 90s, we were in a deficit spending period. But then later in the 1980s, 90s, during the Clinton administration, we started running slight budget surpluses, and the political leadership in Washington thought that the era of budget deficits was over. But then we had some economic downturns and some tax code policy changes, such that revenues have really never caught up. And then this big dip you see here is the 2008, 9, 10 economic crisis and the Great Recession in the United States. And then you see the revenues coming back up. But we at one point ran a federal budget deficit of $1.4 trillion and then got up to a deficit of $400 billion. These deficits have increased again as a result of the major tax cuts under the Trump administration. And I suspect that these also will, because of the major stimulus spending taking place with respect to coronavirus, you're going to see that budget deficit number increase. So then what I show here is federal budget deficits and then the federal national debt as a percent of the gross domestic product from 1940 to 2022, and the years from about 2018 to 2022 are estimates. I think we'd want to look at better data from during this coronavirus recession. And I want to be clear here that what I mean by a budget deficit and debt are slightly different things. A deficit is the difference between how much the government takes in and how much it spends in any given year. The national debt is the accumulation of all the borrowing that the federal government has done. The federal government of the United States issues debt, treasury bonds, things like that, which people buy as very safe investments to help fund the difference between what the government takes in and what it spends. And so as you can see, the national debt in right after World War II was about 120% of gross domestic product because we borrowed a lot of money to pay for the war. And a lot of that debt was held by private Americans through things like war bonds, and you could buy small bonds. There were like savings bonds followed that. Savings bonds really aren't available anymore. But there were all kinds of ways that people could participate in funding the federal government. As you can see, as the economy grew and as we moved out of the post-war era, the share of the economy accounted for by the national debt fell below 40% into the early 1980s. And then it started to climb again throughout the 1980s and then climbed again at a rapid rate into the late 20 teens and into the early 2020s. And I suspect we're going to start inching up towards that 120% number, which means that the national debt is 1.2 times the value of all the goods and services produced in the United States in any given year. That's what the GDP is just the value of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. So a lot of people say that's an awful lot of money because our economy isn't generating enough money to help pay for the debts that our country has incurred. And a lot of people are worried that the national debt does things like crowd out private investment and other more productive activities. So there's some concern about these numbers. Now, another economic number that everyone looks at, probably more so than even GDP or the federal budget deficit, is unemployment. And I went ahead and updated the data on unemployment because of the pandemic. I didn't want to leave you with a distorted sense of what unemployment looks like in the United States. So I updated figure 2.17 from the book using data from into 2020. And you can see noticeably that the unemployment rate in the United States for a brief period of time spiked at a little under 15%. It may, in fact, have been higher, but there was substantial unemployment. But then employment snapped back and is in the roughly 7% unemployment range in the United States in 2020 during the pandemic. It may become a little bit worse if we have to go to more stringent shutdowns here in the coming months. This is recorded in December of 2020, but that number is likely to recover as vaccines become more available and as the economy and as people's confidence in getting out in public recover. But what are the policy implications of all of this? What does this mean, in other words, for the public policy process? Well, first, the national debt is approaching historic highs, which is really disturbing to a lot of people. In particular, budget deficits are historically large. I suspect it's because Congress is happy to spend money because it confers political advantages to members of Congress to bring money into the district, but there's no particular appetite for charging taxes at the rate that we charged taxes in the 1950s and 60s. Taxes are relatively low in American history right now, especially on the wealthiest earners, which is contributing to budget deficits. Now, government debt and spending influences economic growth and policy initiatives because the pressures created by the debt sometimes put pressure on things like transfer payments. Transfer payments are when the government basically gives money to people for various things, such as what we used to call welfare, temporary need assistance to needy families, things like that. And so when the government has less money, there may be less appetite to spend things on transfer payments, less appetite to buy various goods and services that the government produces, and perhaps less appetite for tax expenditures and subsidies. A tax expenditure is when instead of actually spending the federal government's money, you forego a tax in order to achieve some economic benefit. So for example, it used to be that most people could deduct the interest from their mortgage off their income taxes, and that encouraged home ownership. That benefit for most people has gone away with changes in the tax code. But all of these things rely on reasonably robust access on the part of the federal government to money to buy goods and services, to provide payments to people, like I said, for welfare programs or for agricultural subsidy programs or things like that, or to change the tax code to encourage economically beneficial behavior. Now, governments often spend to reduce joblessness through stimulation of the economy, things like public works projects, infrastructure, and in this coronavirus pandemic, just cash payments to citizens. Whether those cash payments have much of a stimulative effect, we won't really know for a while. But we do know that these expenditures increase deficits, at least in the short term. Now, I've said a couple times that we really don't tax wealthy people to the rates we used to in the 50s and 60s. And one of the biggest problems as a result of that and other policies is growing income inequality in the United States. And this is a feature of the economy that deserves some attention. And it's what I turn to next. And what this chart shows is the distribution of household income in the United States by quintile. And what I mean by that is if you take all the people in the United States and divide them into groups, into 5 groups, 20% each. Imagine if you had 100 people and you put 20 people in the first group, that'd be the first quintile, 20 in the second quintile, and so on. And so you ask yourself, okay, what proportion of the national income, household income, is accounted for by each quintile, from the poorest quintile, the bottom quintile, to the richest quintile, the top quintile? In a perfectly even distribution of wealth, every quintile would have about the same amount. In other words, they would all sit on the 20% line. So if we were perfectly even, it wouldn't make sense to talk of quintiles, but everyone would sit on this line. The first, second, third, fourth, fifth, all at 20%. But that's not how income is distributed in the United States. Household income in the United States, for example, the poorest 20% of Americans make about 5% of aggregate household income in the United States. The second poorest quintile makes a little less than 10%. So in other words, the poorest 40% of people make about 15% of aggregate household income. Let me repeat that one more time. The poorest 40% of households earn about 15% of all the household income in the United States. By contrast, the fifth quintile, the 20% at the top, have increased their share of national income from about 43% right after 1967 to a little over 50% by 2017. In other words, 20% of families earn more than half the income in the United States. To this chart, I've added a line that shows the top 1/2 of 1%. That means that out of 200 people, this would be one person. So if you had 200 people, you'd have 40 people in this group, 40 people in this group, 40 people in this group. But you would have one person who earns a little more than 20% of all the income in that group. And you can see that that share of income has increased quite a bit from the 1970s and 80s up into the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of people are starting to question whether this is a good idea from an equity perspective or from an economic perspective. And I want to show you one other statistic to show how the United States compares to other countries. And this is a depiction of a measure called the Gini Index, named after an economist who developed this number. And this number represents wealth inequality, where a higher number means that the country has higher levels of wealth inequality. And so a country like South Africa, for example, has a Gini index that exceeds 0.6, which is really high. And then if you get into other countries like Greece, it's a little over 0.3. Norway, as we know, one of the Nordic countries, is around 0.27. So those are Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland are all in this range, relatively even wealth distribution. And you wouldn't call these poor countries, they're just more evenly distributed. The United States ranks near the top of the world in terms of income inequality, and it raises some interesting questions about whether this is a good idea from a policy perspective. So let's get into that a little bit. So as I said, the wealthiest fifth of the population has become more wealthy, and the wealthiest 1/2 of 1% has become more wealthy over the last several decades, whereas all other economic strata have lost their share of national income. So this has led to debates over wealth distribution in the United States. The question is this good or is this not good? This is a political question to a considerable extent, and one that policymakers are engaged in right now, and that has an influence on public policy. Now, for example, the continuance of the tax cuts under the Bush administration for the top earners, and in fact, the further reduction of marginal tax rates on top earners has further reinforced the tendencies in the United States for the wealthiest people to have a greater share of national income. Normatively, is this fair? That's a question that everybody has to answer on their own. Is this a good idea economically? Maybe not. But the fact of the matter is the United States does display high income inequality, higher than just about any major industrialized power in the world. And so a lot of people have raised serious questions about this. Now, too much inequality can hurt the economy. One of the arguments is that when a lot of really wealthy people earn most of the income, there's really just that much less money available for the consumer economy because these people tend to save it. They tend not to spend it at the same rate that other people would spend it. People in, say, the second or third quintile would spend it. So the question is whether or not this accumulation of wealth is leading to economic benefits. A lot of people argue that low tax rates are important because then it encourages people to invest. But is that happening? That's something that we would want to take a careful look at. And then inequality raises questions about fairness. And so then we have normative questions in policy debate over whether or not income distribution is fair or unfair. And as a result, political action can be taken that's aimed at reducing inequality. A lot of the more progressive members of the United States House and to some extent the Senate have made arguments suggesting that the marginal tax rate for truly wealthy people really should be higher. So to sum up, the United States government, by and large, spends more money than it takes in. So therefore has to borrow a great deal of money. And the question is whether or not that has economic implications. The reason that's important is because any alterations to economic conditions can have implications for gross domestic product growth, and in particular for employment growth and the unemployment rate, which is something to which people are very sensitive in the United States. Debates over wealth inequality are likely to be an important part of policymaking in the 2020s, and some people are going to be making strong arguments to suggest that government tax policy right now is not fair. Other people are going to make arguments to suggest that government tax policy is in the right place, or that wealthy people should even get more tax cuts. Whether you agree with one position or another, you should take a look at economic data. You should be attentive to what's going on in the economy. It's not only really interesting because the economy is what creates the conditions under which we can all work and enjoy the fruits of our labor, but it's also interesting because the shape of the economy, the nature of the economy, the nature of the wealth generated by the economy creates opportunities or constraints on government action, and therefore influences public policy.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomburkland.com or visit my website, tomburkland.com. Thanks again for watching.